The ballroom of the Whitmore Grand was exactly the kind of place that made ordinary people feel invisible. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 40 feet high. Waitstaff in white gloves moved between guests like ghosts, and the conversation that filled the room carried the particular sound of money, low, confident, unhurried. Everyone here belonged. Everyone here had been carefully invited, carefully vetted, carefully placed. Nobody noticed the girl standing near the service corridor. She was 12 years old, dark-skinned, wearing a pale yellow dress that had been ironed carefully but was still unmistakably out of place in a room like this. Her name was Amara. She wasn't there as a guest. She wasn't there to be seen at all. She was simply waiting for her mother, who was working the event and trying very hard to disappear into the wall behind her. She almost managed it. Victoria Harrington noticed her first. What happened next took less than 10 seconds. A sharp remark delivered just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A long, deliberate pause. And then a full glass of red wine raised and tilted with the kind of casual certainty that belongs only to people who have never once feared consequences. The wine hit Amara's dress and splattered across her chest and arms. Some guests went quiet. A few looked away. Someone laughed just once, just briefly. And then the conversation around them resumed, as though nothing had happened at all. A child had just been publicly humiliated, and the room's only response was to move on. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. Amara stood perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not run. She did not beg or shout back. She just stood there, chin lifted slightly, hands at her sides while the red stain spread slowly across the front of her dress. In any other moment, in any other room, that might have been the end of the story. But in the far corner of that ballroom, half hidden behind a column, a woman had watched the entire scene from beginning to end. She had watched Victoria Harrington walk toward the girl. She had watched the glass go up. She had watched the girl's face in the moment after, and she had noted very carefully what she did not see there. No collapse, no begging, no surrender. Just a 12-year-old girl deciding in real time that she still had her dignity. That woman had a decision to make, and by the end of the night, it would cost the Harrington family $650 million. If you're new here, stories like this one come out every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Amara was the kind of child adults described as mature for her age, which usually meant she had learned early that the world did not make things easy and had decided to be okay with that. She was 12, sharp-minded, and at the top of her class at a public school on the east side of the city where the hallways were crowded and the textbooks were outdated and the teachers were tired but still trying. She read everything she could get her hands on. She asked questions that made her teachers pause before answering. She had a quiet, steady quality about her that people noticed without always being able to name a sense that she was paying attention to more than what was directly in front of her. Her mother, Grace, had raised her alone. Grace worked for a company called Prestige Event Services, which provided staffing and logistics for high-end galas, private dinners, and corporate functions across the city. The work was physically demanding, and the hours were unpredictable, but it paid reliably, and Grace was good at it. She was organized, professional, and had been with the company long enough to be trusted with the larger events. The Whitmore Grand assignment was the largest she had ever been given. On the evening of the gala, Grace had exhausted every option for childcare and found none. Her regular babysitter was sick. Her neighbor was out of town. She had no family nearby. In the end, she made a decision she was not comfortable with. She would bring Amara with her and keep the girl out of sight in the service area for the 3 hours the event required. She had explained everything clearly on the drive over. Stay near the service corridor. Don't wander. Don't touch anything. If anyone asks who you are, tell them your mother works the event. And stay quiet. Amara had nodded at each instruction. She understood what her mother was not saying directly, that they were guests of necessity, not of welcome, and the best thing they could do was remain invisible. The event itself was not simply a party. The Harrington family had arranged the gala as the final social gesture before closing a partnership deal with a national investment group called Foster Capital. The number attached to the deal was $650 million, a figure that had been circulating quietly among the city's business community for months. The Harrington name carried weight in this city. Richard Harrington had built the family's real estate and development portfolio over 30 years, and his wife Victoria managed their public image with the same precision he applied to contracts. Together they occupied a specific position in the city's upper tier, not the oldest money, not the most powerful, but visible, connected, and very carefully maintained. The gala was meant to be the final affirmation of all of that. A room full of the right people, the right atmosphere, and the Harrington family at the center of it. What they had not planned for was Margaret Foster. Margaret Foster was the founder and chairwoman of Foster Capital. She was 62 years old, had built the company from a single office with 2 employees, and had grown it into one of the most respected private investment groups in the country. She was known in business circles for 2 things: her precision in evaluating risk and her habit of making final decisions based not only on financial analysis, but on what she called character due diligence, her own direct observation of the people she was considering doing business with. She had a principle she rarely spoke aloud, but applied consistently. You want to know who someone really is? Watch how they treat the people who can do nothing for them. It was not a sentiment. It was a methodology. Margaret had sent her team to evaluate the Harrington deal for months. The numbers were sound. The projections were strong. But there had been details in the background reports that gave her pause. A labor dispute settled quietly out of court. Former employees who had declined to give references, a pattern of behavior that no single incident could confirm, but that added up over time to a question she had not yet answered. She had decided to attend the gala herself, not to celebrate, to observe. She arrived early, declined to be seated at the main table, and positioned herself near a column at the far edge of the ballroom where she had a clear view of the room without being at the center of it. She had been standing there for 40 minutes when she noticed a girl in a pale yellow dress standing quietly near the service corridor. She thought nothing of it at first. That was about to change. The moment that changed everything began the way most disasters do, quietly and with a misunderstanding. Grace had asked Amara to wait near the service corridor while she carried a set of equipment cases to the staging area on the other side of the ballroom. It was supposed to take 5 minutes. Amara stood where her mother had left her, back against the wall, watching the room without entering it. The problem was the corridor itself. The particular stretch of hallway where Amara had been told to wait sat at an awkward angle between the service entrance and the edge of the VIP reception area. From most angles inside the ballroom, it looked like the girl was standing at the boundary of the guest space, close enough that someone looking over might assume she had wandered in. Victoria Harrington was not someone who let assumptions sit unanswered. She was in the middle of a conversation with 2 other women when she glanced toward the corridor and saw Amara. She paused mid-sentence. Something in her expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like offense, the particular kind that comes from feeling that one's carefully arranged environment has been disrupted without permission. She excused herself and crossed the room. Amara saw her coming but didn't move. She had been told to stay where she was. She stayed. Victoria stopped 2 feet in front of her, close enough that Amara had to look up to meet her eyes. Victoria was tall, expensively dressed, wearing a perfume that cost more than Grace made in a week. She looked at the girl the way someone might look at a smudge on an otherwise clean surface. "Who let you in here?" she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the particular quality of someone who had spent a lifetime being listened to. Amara answered carefully. "My mother works the event, ma'am. She asked me to wait here." Victoria looked her over the yellow dress, the worn shoes, the small braids pulled back from her face, and her expression didn't change. "Your mother works here," she repeated slowly, as though considering what to do with that information. "Then you belong in the back, not here." She gestured vaguely toward the corridor behind Amara. "This area is for guests." "I'm not in the guest area," Amara said. "I'm in the hallway." It was a factual statement delivered without aggression. It was also, in that moment, exactly the wrong thing to say. Victoria's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. The women she had been speaking with had drifted close enough to hear. A few other guests had noticed the exchange and turned their attention toward it, sensing the low-level charge in the air. "You don't get to correct me," Victoria said quietly. "Not here. Not tonight." She reached out and took a fresh glass of red wine from the tray of a passing waiter, a single fluid motion unhurried as though she had already decided what she was going to do next and was simply completing the sequence. Amara had time to see what was coming. She did not move. The wine hit her full across the chest and the front of her dress, the red spreading fast against the pale yellow fabric droplets running down her arms and dripping onto the marble floor. Victoria set the empty glass back down on a nearby table with a small, precise click. "Find your mother," she said, "and stay where you belong." Then she turned and walked back to her guests. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The people who had been watching looked away. A man near the bar said something that made the woman beside him laugh softly. The room folded back into its own noise, its music, its carefully maintained sense of occasion. Amara stood in the middle of it and felt everything at once, the cold wetness spreading across her chest, the heat behind her eyes, the particular shame of being made small in front of strangers who had already decided she wasn't worth defending. For a few seconds, the world blurred at the edges, and her throat tightened, and she thought she might not be able to hold it together. But somewhere underneath all of it, beneath the humiliation and the shock, something quieter held firm. A voice that sounded like her mother on the drive over, like every conversation they'd had at the kitchen table, like every morning, Grace had gotten up and gone to work and come home and done it again without complaint. "You are not less than anyone in that room. Don't you ever act like you are." Amara's hands, which had lifted slightly at her sides by reflex, came back down. Her chin, which had dropped for just a moment, lifted again. She did not wipe her eyes. She did not run. She stood. Grace arrived from across the room 30 seconds later, nearly dropping the clipboard in her hand when she saw her daughter. She crossed the distance between them fast, crouching down to look at Amara's dress, at her face, at the wine still dripping from the hem of her sleeve. "Oh, baby," Grace started. "I'm okay," Amara said. Her voice was even. Grace looked up at the room, at the people who had already turned away, and understood immediately the full shape of what had just happened, and the full shape of what they could not do about it. Her eyes went to Victoria Harrington, who had resumed her conversation without looking back. Grace stood up slowly. Her expression held something complicated, fury and helplessness occupying the same space, one suppressing the other. She took Amara's hand and began to move toward the service exit. From her position near the far column, Margaret Foster had not moved. She had watched the entire thing not with the frozen stillness of someone in shock, but with the focused attention of someone cataloging information. She had watched Victoria cross the room. She had watched the glass go up. She had watched Amara in the seconds after the hands that came up and went back down the chin that dropped, and then lifted the silence that was not weakness, but something closer to its opposite. She had also watched the room do nothing. She thought about the background reports, the settled grievances, the employees who wouldn't speak, the contractor who had described the Harrington culture as professionally polished and personally brutal. She had been willing to set those details aside as long as they remained unconfirmed. They were no longer unconfirmed. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out her phone, and sent a message to her chief of staff. "Prepare the withdrawal letter. We're done here. But don't move yet. I want to stay another hour. I want to see what they do next." That last line was important. Margaret Foster had not built 40 years of business on instinct alone. She had built it on patience, on the discipline of watching a situation long enough to see its full shape before drawing conclusions. She wanted to know whether what she had just witnessed was an aberration or a confirmation. She already suspected she knew the answer. She intended to be certain. She ordered a glass of water from a passing waiter and stayed where she was. The formal announcement came 40 minutes after the incident, enough time for Margaret's chief of staff to finalize the letter and for Margaret herself to have observed without surprise that not a single member of the Harrington family had checked on the girl or her mother. Her chief of staff approached Richard Harrington near the center of the ballroom, spoke to him quietly for no more than 30 seconds, and handed him a sealed envelope. Richard read the single page inside, folded it once, and placed it in his jacket pocket without changing his expression, the practiced composure of a man who had learned long ago never to show damage in public. He found Victoria at the edge of the room and spoke to her in a low voice. Whatever he said made her go very still. The news moved through the Harrington inner circle within minutes. By the time the gala's final course was being served, the people who needed to know already knew Foster Capital was withdrawing from the deal. No negotiation, no follow-up meeting, no explanation offered beyond a single line in the letter. A fundamental misalignment in values that cannot be reconciled at this stage of the process. $650 million gone. The guests, who were close enough to the Harrington family to understand what had happened, spent the rest of the evening in the careful, particular silence of people watching something collapse and choosing not to acknowledge it. The guests who didn't know simply enjoyed the dessert course. By the time the ballroom began to empty, Victoria Harrington had identified the cause. Not herself. Never herself. The girl. The following morning, Grace received a call from her supervisor at Prestige Event Services. The message was careful and professional in its language, which made it worse. There had been a complaint filed by the event's primary client. The complaint alleged that an unauthorized minor had been present in a restricted area during the function, that the minor's presence had caused a disturbance, and that Grace had violated company policy by bringing a family member to a contracted work site. The supervisor was sorry. These things had to be taken seriously. Grace was being placed on temporary suspension pending a review. Grace sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. Amara watched her from the doorway and said nothing. By that afternoon, the story had begun to circulate in the way that stories do when one side has money and the other side doesn't, unevenly, and with a particular shape already built in. Among the staff and management at the Whitmore Grand, the version being discussed was that a worker had brought her daughter to the event. The daughter had wandered into the VIP section, and the resulting confusion had created an awkward scene during an important business function. The client was understandably frustrated. It was an unfortunate situation. Nobody mentioned the wine. Nobody mentioned who had crossed the room. Amara went to school the next day because Grace told her to, and because staying home felt like surrendering something she couldn't name. She sat through her classes and did her work, and on the bus ride home she stared out the window and thought about how a room full of adults had watched what happened to her and decided collectively that it was easier not to have seen it. The person who decided he had seen enough was a man named Thomas Reed. Thomas had worked in hospitality for 22 years, the last 9 of them as senior operations manager at the Whitmore Grand. He had been near the service corridor when it happened. He had seen the whole thing from a distance of about 30 feet. He had also reviewed the security footage the following morning as part of his standard post-event walkthrough. The footage was clear. It showed Amara standing in the staff corridor, not the VIP area, not the guest section, but the corridor designated specifically for event personnel. It showed Victoria Harrington walking across the ballroom toward her. It showed the wine. Thomas sat with that footage for the better part of an hour. Then he made 2 calls. The first was to the hotel's legal counsel to report what he had seen and to formally request that the footage be preserved. The second was to the Foster Capital legal team, who had already reached out to the hotel the previous evening requesting any available security recordings from the event. They had contacted Thomas directly because, as the senior operations manager who had signed off on the event's technical setup, he was the person with formal authority over the recordings, and because Margaret Foster, who was still quietly watching from a distance, had instructed her team to move quickly and carefully. Thomas connected those dots only later. At the time, he simply knew what he had seen and what the footage showed, and he knew that Grace had been suspended that morning for something that was not her fault. He chose to do something with what he knew. What emerged over the following 48 hours was larger than Thomas had anticipated. When Foster Capital's legal team reviewed the footage alongside their existing background file on the Harrington family, the picture it completed was one they had already suspected but had not been able to confirm. The 4-month review had turned up a pattern: a former property manager who had filed a workplace grievance and been paid to drop it, 2 ex-employees who had given only minimum required responses when contacted, and a contractor who had described the internal culture at Harrington Development as professionally polished and personally brutal. None of those details had been enough individually to end the deal. Together and alongside what the footage now showed plainly, they answered the question Margaret had come to the Whitmore Grand to answer. Thomas's disclosure also changed the internal conversation at the hotel itself. When the legal team confirmed his account, the complaint against Grace had no foundation. The recording showed directly that Amara had never left the staff corridor. The disturbance had been created not by the child, but by the woman who had walked across the room and targeted her. Grace's suspension was quietly reversed. Her supervisor called and said there had been an error in how the complaint had been processed, and that her position remained secure. Grace thanked him, hung up, and pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter for a moment, steadying herself. Amara was at the table doing homework when Grace came back into the room. She looked up. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Not yet," Grace said, "but getting there." She sat down across from her daughter, and neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't know yet that Victoria Harrington was not finished. Victoria Harrington had not built her position in this city by absorbing losses quietly. The central lesson she had learned from a lifetime of watching power operate was simple. When something goes wrong, the first person to define the story wins. It didn't matter what had actually happened. What mattered was what people believed had happened, and who got to say it first. Within 24 hours, a version of events had begun to move through the city's connected circles. The version was consistent and carefully structured. A worker had violated her employment terms by bringing her child to a restricted professional environment. The child had created a disruption. The client had responded perhaps too sharply, yes, but understandably, to what had felt like a provocation. And as for Foster Capital's withdrawal, that was a business decision driven by internal factors that had nothing to do with the evening's events. A local business blog published a piece framing the situation along those lines. The comments filled quickly. Some were skeptical. Some were openly contemptuous of what one commenter called people who insert themselves into spaces they weren't meant to occupy. Amara's classmates found the article by the second day. She knew because of the way conversations stopped when she walked past. One girl asked her directly at lunch whether her mother had really gotten a rich family's deal canceled. Amara said she didn't want to talk about it. The girl shrugged and moved on, but the question stayed with Amara for the rest of the afternoon, sitting in her chest like a stone. She had not done anything wrong. She had stood in a hallway. She had been quiet and still and careful exactly as she had been told, and none of it had mattered. On the third day, a letter arrived at Grace's apartment. It was 4 pages long, printed on Harrington Development letterhead, written in the dense language that legal documents use when they want to communicate threat, without technically making one. The substance: Grace had violated her employment contract. The resulting disruption had caused material damages to the Harrington family's professional interests. The family was prepared to pursue the matter formally, unless Grace signed an attached statement accepting full responsibility. There was also a second document, shorter, intended for Amara. Its language described the events of the evening in a way that positioned the girl as having entered a restricted area without authorization and caused a scene. Signing it would mean putting her name to a version of events that was not true. Grace read both documents twice. Then she sat very still. She was still sitting there when Amara came home from school. Amara dropped her backpack by the door, saw her mother's face and the papers on the table, and sat down across from her without being asked. After a long silence, Amara asked, "Do you think I did something wrong?" "No," Grace said. I know you didn't. Then why would we say that we did? Grace didn't answer right away. Because they're powerful, she said finally. And we're not. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then, we don't have to be powerful to tell the truth. Grace looked at her daughter, this child she had raised alone in a small apartment on a salary that required careful management every single month, and she felt the exhaustion in her shift slightly. Not disappear. Just shift. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Amara's. No, she said. We don't. She left the documents unsigned on the table. Neither of them slept well that night, but in the morning they were still there together unbent, and that felt like something. Thomas Reed called that evening. He had gotten Grace's number through the hotel's HR system and said up front that he was aware calling her directly was not entirely within his role. I want to be straightforward with you, he said. I've been trying to figure out the right way to handle this for 3 days, and I've decided the right way is just to tell you what I know. He told her about the footage. He told her exactly what it showed. He told her that the hotel had reversed her suspension on the basis of the recording, and that Foster Capital's legal team, who had been in contact with him because he was the one who had preserved and provided the footage, had a message for her. Margaret Foster was aware of the documents the Harrington family had sent, and she was prepared to provide a formal on-record statement confirming what she had personally witnessed at the gala if Grace wanted it. Grace sat down slowly. Why would she do that? She asked. Something she said when she left the gala, Thomas replied. I heard it secondhand, but the way it was described, she said she came to that event to find out who the Harrington family really was, and she found out. He paused. Don't sign those documents. Grace didn't. When the Harrington attorney called the following morning to confirm receipt, Grace told him clearly that neither she nor her daughter would be signing anything and that any further communication should be directed to their legal representative. She did not yet have one, but by that afternoon, she did. A civil rights attorney named Carol Simmons had seen Thomas Reed's account. He had given a brief factual statement to a journalist he trusted and called Grace directly to offer her services. Carol had handled 4 previous cases against Harrington business entities, none of which had reached trial because all 4 had been settled confidentially. They're very good at making problems disappear quietly, Carol told Grace. The reason they want your signature is because without it, the problem stays visible. And visible is what they can't afford right now. The security footage was released the following day. Thomas had worked with the hotel's legal counsel to confirm what could be disclosed, and the answer given that the recording constituted evidence in an active legal matter was all of it. The footage was clear, time-stamped, and unambiguous. It showed Amara in the staff corridor. It showed Victoria Harrington walking toward her. It showed the glass going up. It showed the room doing nothing. The footage moved fast. Within hours, it had been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. By the following morning, millions. The reaction had the quality of collective recognition that builds when something privately suspected is publicly confirmed, the sense of course, this is what happens, this is what has always happened, and the particular fury that comes from watching it documented with no room left for interpretation. Victoria Harrington's face was visible in the recording. There was no question about who had done what. The formal statement from Margaret Foster came the same day. It was brief, precise, and written in the plain language of someone who understood that the clearest sentences carry the most weight. She confirmed she had been present at the gala. She confirmed she had personally witnessed the incident. She confirmed that the decision to withdraw had been made that evening, and that while the background review had already raised significant concerns, what she observed had been the determining factor. We evaluate every potential partner on the basis of who they are, not only what they can deliver. What I witnessed that evening was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was a window into how the Harrington family exercises power when they believe the cost of doing so is low. That is not a partner Foster Capital is willing to have. She did not use Amara's name in the statement at Grace's request. The response was total. Richard Harrington issued a statement calling the situation a private matter that has been mischaracterized. It was widely mocked. A second statement followed expressing regret for any distress caused during what was an emotionally charged evening, one that named no one, described nothing, and offered nothing that could be mistaken for an actual apology. As for Richard himself, the man who had spent 30 years building the Harrington name, found himself watching it come apart, and discovering too late that the image he had always believed was the family's greatest asset had in fact been its most fragile one. Victoria disappeared from public view. Her charity board announced she had stepped down to focus on personal matters. The business blog deleted its original piece and issued a correction. Carol Simmons filed a formal complaint with the city's Human Rights Commission on Grace and Amara's behalf. The Harrington attorneys went quiet. 3 weeks after this gala, a letter arrived at Grace's apartment. It was handwritten on plain cream paper in the careful script of someone who believed certain things deserved to be said by hand. Grace read it once at the kitchen table. Then she called Amara in and read it aloud. Margaret wrote that she did not believe in sentiment for its own sake, and she wanted to be clear that what she was offering was not charity and should not be received as such. She had spent her career making investments in people based on her assessment of their fundamental character. The most reliable indicator she had found over 40 years was how a person behaved when no one with power was watching, and when the cost of behaving well was high. She had watched Amara in the seconds after the wine hit her dress. She had watched a 12-year-old girl alone and humiliated in a room full of strangers make a decision about who she was going to be in that moment. And she had watched her hold to it. I have met adults who could not do what you did that night. I have met executives with decades of experience who have broken under less. She was offering to fund Amara's education in full from the current school year through the completion of a 4-year college degree through the Foster Foundation's academic scholarship program. No conditions beyond the standard academic requirements of the program. No expectation of continued connection to the events of that evening. This is not a reward for what happened to you. It is an investment in who you already are. Those are different things, and I want you to understand the difference. At the bottom below the signature, a single handwritten line, "You didn't need anyone in that room to tell you who you were. I hope you never forget that." Grace set the letter down between them. Amara looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "She didn't do anything while it was happening." "No," Grace said carefully, "not in the moment. But she did something after." "Yes." Amara thought about that with the particular seriousness of someone who wants to get something right before responding. Then she said, "Okay." Not with the brightness of someone who had been rescued, with the steadiness of someone who had already decided they were going to be all right, and was now simply noting that the road ahead had gotten a little clearer. She went back to her homework. Grace sat at the table a while longer, the letter in front of her, the apartment quiet around her. What had happened to Amara in that ballroom had happened, and no statement or footage or scholarship could reach back and undo it. The wine had been real. The silence of the room had been real. The letter from the attorney had been real. But the story had not ended the way Victoria Harrington had intended it to end. It had ended with a 12-year-old girl at a kitchen table doing her homework in a home that was still hers. The Harrington family had walked into that gala with everything arranged. The room, the guests, the deal, the image they had spent decades perfecting. They had believed, as people with that kind of power often do, that the cost of what they chose to do was theirs alone to set. They had not accounted for the woman at the far edge of the ballroom watching. They had not accounted for the hotel manager who spent 22 years learning the difference between what was easy and what should be done. They had not accounted for the girl in the pale yellow dress who had stood in a staff corridor and decided in the worst moment of her young life that she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her collapse. $650 million not lost because of a child. Lost because of who they were when they thought the only people watching were the ones who already agreed with them. That is the thing about character. It doesn't perform. It doesn't wait for the right audience. It just shows up in boardrooms, in ballrooms, in the 10 seconds after a glass of wine hits a 12-year-old girl's dress in front of a room full of people who have decided not to see it. It shows up in the people who choose to stay silent. And it shows up in the ones who don't. Amara never needed a room full of powerful people to tell her who she was. She already knew. And in the end, that quiet, unbending knowledge, the kind that no one can hand you and no one can take away, turned out to be worth more than anything in that ballroom. If this story stayed with you, there's a good chance the next one will too. Subscribe so you catch it when it comes out, and if someone you know needed to hear this today, send it their way.